Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through the shadowed corridors of ancient Rome, where power and scandal dance together in ways that would make modern tabloids blush. Tonight, we're stepping into a world of marble palaces and whispered conspiracies, where one woman's ambition would shake the very foundations of an empire. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking escape from the modern world, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet hours with me. Our story unfolds in the heart of the Roman Empire during the reign of Claudius, when the Mediterranean world trembled at the mention of Rome's legions. But behind the gilded doors of the Palatine Hill, a different kind of war was being waged. A war fought not with swords and shields, but with whispered promises, stolen glances, and deadly ambitions that would ultimately consume everyone they touched. Have you ever wondered how a single woman could manipulate the most powerful men of her age while the fate of millions hung in the balance? The answer lies in understanding Valeria Messalina, whose name would become synonymous with both irresistible beauty and insatiable hunger for power. What I'm about to reveal will transport you into a world where every smile concealed a dagger, every feast might be your last, and where the line between love and destruction was as thin as a spider's web. This isn't merely a tale of one woman's rise and fall. This is the story of how unchecked desire and political ambition could corrupt even the mightiest empire on earth, creating ripples that would influence the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the imperial palace as 16-year-old Valeria Messalina prepared for what would become the defining moment of her young life. The year was 38 CE, and the corridors of power hummed with whispered conversations about the emperor's nephew Claudius and his need for a suitable wife. But Messalina was no ordinary candidate for imperial marriage. Born into the ancient patrician family of the Valeria Messalina, she carried in her veins the blood of consuls and generals who had shaped Rome's destiny for generations. Her daily routine began before dawn in her family's sprawling villa on the Aventine Hill, where slaves moved like silent phantoms through rooms adorned with frescoes depicting the triumphs of her ancestors. The morning ritual was always the same. First came the careful arrangement of her orb and hair, each strand positioned to catch the light in ways that would emphasize the classical beauty that had already begun to turn heads throughout the city. Her personal slave, a Greek woman named Pythus, who had served the family since before Messalina's birth, understood that every detail of her mistress's appearance was a weapon in the arsenal of ambition. The selection of jewelry alone required careful consideration. Today, as on every day when she might encounter someone of political importance, Messalina chose pieces that spoke of her family's ancient lineage while subtly displaying their continued wealth and influence. A golden fibula shaped like an eagle, symbol of Roman power, fastened her silk stola. Emerald earrings from Egypt caught the morning light, while rings bearing the seals of her noble ancestors adorned fingers that would soon hold the fate of an empire. But it was the preparation of her mind that truly set Messalina apart from the other young women of Rome's elite. While her contemporaries spent their mornings studying poetry and music, Messalina absorbed lessons in statecraft from her mother, Domitia Lepida, a woman who understood that knowledge was the most valuable currency in imperial Rome. These weren't gentle conversations about household management or proper deportment. They were intensive briefings on the complex web of alliances, grudges, and ambitions that determined who lived and who died in the shadow of the Palatine Hill. Her mother would quiz her relentlessly about the genealogies of important families, the voting patterns of senators, and the personal weaknesses of potential allies and enemies. Messalina learned to memorize not just names and faces, but the subtle details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. She knew which senator had gambling debts, which consul's wife was conducting an affair, and which praetor's son had shown Republican sympathies that might be exploited or exposed, depending on political necessity. The education extended beyond mere gossip and intrigue. Messalina studied rhetoric with the same intensity that young men brought to their preparation for public careers. She learned to construct arguments that could persuade, manipulate, or destroy depending on her needs. Her tutors, carefully selected Greek freedmen who had served in various capacities throughout the empire, taught her to read not just words, but the spaces between words. They showed her how a pause could be more powerful than a speech, how silence could convey more threat than the loudest accusation. Mathematics came naturally to her, not for its abstract beauty, but for its practical applications in understanding the flow of money and resources that kept the empire functioning. She could calculate tax revenues from distant provinces, estimate the cost of maintaining legions on the frontier, and project the economic impact of various policy decisions with accuracy that would have impressed the most experienced treasury officials. But perhaps most importantly, Messalina learned to observe. Every morning, she would position herself at strategic locations within her family's villa, where she could watch the comings and goings of visitors, slaves, and family members. She noticed which slaves seemed nervous, which visitors lingered longer than necessary, and which family members appeared to be concealing information. These observations became the foundation for understanding that information was power, and power was survival. The afternoon hours brought different challenges, as Messalina accompanied her mother to the social gatherings that formed the backbone of Roman political life. These weren't casual visits, but carefully orchestrated encounters where every word carried weight, and every gesture communicated allegiance or hostility. In the gardens of other noble families, among the marble statues and carefully manicured cypress trees, the real business of empire was conducted through seemingly innocent conversations about literature, philosophy, and family news. Messalina watched her mother navigate these treacherous waters with the skill of a master diplomat. She learned to decode the subtle language of Roman high society, where a compliment about someone's gardens might actually be a threat, and an invitation to dinner could signal either acceptance into an inner circle or preparation for betrayal. The young woman absorbed these lessons not through formal instruction, but through careful observation of how power flowed through personal relationships and private plots.
Conversations. The evening meals in her family's villa were themselves education in the art of imperial politics. The dining room, decorated with scenes from the Trojan War, hosted gatherings that brought together senators, generals, wealthy merchants, and visiting dignitaries from across the empire. Messalina was allowed to attend these dinners not as a participant, but as an observer whose presence was so natural that guests often forgot she was listening to their most sensitive discussions. From her position on the dining couch, she learned about the Emperor Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior, the growing concern among the Praetorian Guard about the stability of the succession, and the quiet maneuvering of various family members who were positioning themselves for whatever crisis might emerge. She heard detailed discussions about military campaigns in Germania, the management of grain supplies from Egypt, and the delicate negotiations required to maintain peace with Parthia along the eastern frontier. But most crucially, she began to hear whispered conversations about Claudius, the emperor's uncle, who had been largely overlooked for political advancement due to his physical disabilities and scholarly inclinations. The guests at her family's table spoke of him with a mixture of pity and speculation, wondering whether his apparent weakness might actually make him a more manageable candidate for imperial power than the increasingly unstable Caligula. Messalina filed away every detail of these conversations, building in her mind a comprehensive understanding of the political landscape that surrounded the imperial family. She learned that Claudius, despite his stammering speech and physical awkwardness, possessed an intellectual capacity that many underestimated. His extensive writings on history and his deep knowledge of Roman law and tradition had earned him respect among scholars and certain senators who valued competence over charisma. More importantly, she began to understand that Claudius represented an opportunity. His age, his lack of a stable marriage, and his position within the imperial family made him a potentially valuable ally for a young woman with sufficient intelligence and ambition to recognize the possibilities that others missed. While other noble families focused their matrimonial strategies on younger, more obviously powerful men, Messalina began to see Claudius as a path to influence that her competitors would never consider. The physical preparation for these strategic encounters required its own careful attention to detail. Messalina's beauty was not an accident of nature, but the result of systematic cultivation that began each day before sunrise and continued until she retired to her chambers each evening. Her personal slaves maintained an arsenal of cosmetics, perfumes, and treatments that enhanced her natural advantages while concealing any imperfections that might distract from her overall effect. The morning bath was a ritual that combined luxury with practical preparation for the day's challenges. Imported oils from Arabia softened her skin while removing any traces of the previous day's activities. Rose petals from her family's private gardens provided both fragrance and the subtle coloring that enhanced her complexion. The water itself, heated to precise temperatures and infused with minerals from springs near Naples, was changed multiple times to ensure that she emerged not just clean, but luminous. The application of cosmetics required the skills of an artist combined with the strategic thinking of a general. Each choice of color and texture was calculated to produce specific effects on different audiences. For meetings with older senators, she chose understated elegance that suggested wisdom and maturity beyond her years. For encounters with younger men who might be useful allies or sources of information, she employed more dramatic techniques that emphasized her youth and beauty while maintaining an air of untouchable nobility. But the true preparation was mental and emotional. Before each significant social encounter, Messalina would spend time in meditation and planning, considering the various outcomes that might result from different approaches to conversation and behavior. She rehearsed responses to likely questions, planned strategic revelations of information that might prove valuable, and prepared contingency plans for unexpected developments that could either advance or threaten her objectives. This systematic approach to preparation extended to her selection of companions and advisors. Messalina surrounded herself with individuals who brought different types of intelligence and capability to her growing network of influence. Her personal slave, Pythias, provided information gathered from conversations with servants in other households. Her tutor, Marcus, a freedman who had once served as a secretary to important senators, offered insights into the formal procedures and unwritten rules that governed political advancement. Most valuable of all was her friendship with Livia Orestilla, daughter of a prominent equestrian family who had connections throughout the military and commercial establishments that kept the empire functioning. Through Livia, Messalina gained access to information about troop movements, trade agreements, and financial arrangements that most nobles never heard about, but that often determined the success or failure of political initiatives. The two young women would spend hours walking in private gardens, ostensibly discussing literature and philosophy, but actually sharing intelligence about the shifting allegiances and hidden tensions that characterized life in imperial Rome. Their discussions ranged from detailed analysis of recent Senate debates to speculation about the romantic entanglements that might influence important political decisions. These discussions were themselves a form of education that no formal tutor could provide. Through her friendship with Livia, Messalina learned to think strategically about long-term political developments rather than focusing solely on immediate opportunities for advancement. She began to understand how changes in military command structure might affect the balance of power between different family factions, how economic policies could create or eliminate opportunities for political influence, and how personal relationships between powerful individuals could determine the fate of entire provinces. The friendship also provided Messalina with a laboratory for testing different approaches to persuasion and manipulation. She and Livia would practice conversations, taking turns playing the roles of different political figures while working to identify the weaknesses and motivations that could be exploited for political advantage.
Playing different roles and experimenting with various techniques for extracting information, building alliances, or undermining potential opponents. These exercises sharpened Messalina's already formidable skills while helping her develop the confidence that would prove essential when she finally entered the highest circles of imperial power. As the months passed and Caligula's behavior became increasingly erratic, the conversations in noble households throughout Rome began to focus more intensively on questions of succession and stability. Messalina found herself uniquely positioned to observe and analyze these developments due to her family's connections and her own growing reputation for intelligence and discretion. The morning routines, afternoon social gatherings, and evening dinners that structured her daily life became opportunities to gather and process information about the evolving political crisis that would soon engulf the empire. Every conversation, every gesture, every seemingly casual remark was evaluated for its potential significance in the larger pattern of events that was beginning to emerge. And through it all, Messalina continued to refine her understanding of Claudius and the unique opportunity that he represented for a young woman with the vision to see beyond conventional expectations and the courage to act on that vision. When the moment for action finally arrived, the opportunity she had been preparing for arrived on a rain-soaked afternoon in late autumn, when word spread through the noble quarters that Claudius would be attending a literary gathering at the home of Senator Lucius Vitellius. The event, ostensibly organized to celebrate the publication of a new historical work about the conquest of Britain, would bring together scholars, politicians, and members of the imperial family in an atmosphere that encouraged both intellectual discussion and private conversation. Messalina's preparation for this crucial encounter began 3 days in advance. She commissioned her personal seamstresses to create a stola that would distinguish her from the other young women likely to attend, while remaining appropriately modest for a scholarly gathering. The garment, crafted from silk dyed the deep blue of lapis lazuli, was embroidered with golden threads that traced patterns inspired by Greek geometric designs. The effect was sophisticated without being ostentatious, scholarly without being severe. More importantly, she spent those 3 days immersing herself in the specific historical topics that would likely dominate the evening's discussions. Her tutors provided detailed briefings on recent archaeological discoveries in Britain, the strategic implications of various military campaigns, and the scholarly debates surrounding the interpretation of ancient texts that Claudius had contributed to in his own writings. By the time she entered Senator Vitellius's villa, Messalina possessed enough knowledge to engage meaningfully with the most learned participants, while avoiding the appearance of presumption that might alienate potential allies. The villa itself reflected the refined taste that had made Vitellius one of Rome's most respected cultural patrons. Marble columns supported a ceiling decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from Homer's epics, while carefully arranged statuary created intimate conversation areas throughout the spacious atrium. Oil lamps burning the finest grade of olive oil provided warm, steady light that flattered the complexions of guests, while illuminating the scrolls and codices that served as conversation pieces throughout the evening. Claudius arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his entrance marked by the subtle shift in attention that always accompanied members of the imperial family. Despite his physical limitations, he moved through the gathering with dignity and purpose, engaging scholars in discussions that revealed both his extensive knowledge and his genuine passion for historical research. Messalina observed him carefully from across the room, noting how he commanded respect through intellectual authority rather than political intimidation.
Her first direct interaction with the future emperor came during a discussion about the reliability of various historical sources for understanding the conquest of Gaul. Several scholars had gathered around a table displaying maps and documents related to Caesar's campaigns, debating the accuracy of different accounts and their implications for understanding Roman military strategy. Claudius had joined the conversation, offering insights based on his access to imperial archives that contained documents unavailable to other researchers. Messalina approached the group during a natural pause in the discussion, carrying a small scroll that contained excerpts from Gallic tribal chronicles that her family's collection had preserved from earlier conquests. Her entry into the conversation was perfectly timed and expertly executed. Rather than interrupting or drawing attention to herself, she simply placed the scroll on the table and mentioned quietly that it contained perspectives from the conquered peoples that might illuminate some of the questions being debated. The reaction was immediate and gratifying. Claudius examined the document with obvious interest, asking informed questions about its provenance and authenticity that demonstrated both his scholarly rigor and his appreciation for her contribution to the discussion. The other participants welcomed her insights, particularly when she offered translations of difficult passages and explained the historical context that made certain references comprehensible. But it was the private conversation that followed the formal gathering that established the foundation for everything that would come after. As guests began to depart and the evening wound toward its conclusion, Claudius approached Messalina to express his appreciation for her contribution to the scholarly discussions. What began as a polite exchange of compliments evolved into a detailed conversation about historical methodology, the challenges of interpreting ancient sources, and the political implications of different approaches to understanding Rome's past. Messalina had prepared for exactly this possibility, but the reality exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Claudius proved to be not just knowledgeable, but genuinely curious about her opinions and insights. He asked questions that showed he was listening carefully to her responses, offered observations that built on her comments rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, and demonstrated the kind of intellectual generosity that created genuine connection between minds that appreciated each other's capabilities. The conversation revealed aspects of Claudius's character that his public persona often concealed. Away from the formal constraints of imperial protocol, he displayed wit, humor, and a self-deprecating charm that made him much more compelling and sympathetic than the persona that many people only knew from public appearances.
Warmth, and a self-deprecating humor that made his physical limitations seem irrelevant to their interaction. He spoke passionately about his research projects, his hopes for contributing to Rome's understanding of their own history, and his frustration with the political responsibilities that often interfered with his scholarly pursuits. More significantly, he began to reveal the loneliness that characterized his position within the imperial family. Despite his noble birth and proximity to power, Claudius often found himself excluded from important decisions and treated as an intellectual curiosity rather than a serious political figure. His previous marriage had ended in divorce, leaving him without the domestic partnership that might have provided emotional support and political alliance. He spoke wistfully of his desire for a companion who could share his interests and understand the unique pressures of life within the imperial household. Messalina listened with the perfect balance of sympathy and intelligence that encouraged confidences while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her station. She asked thoughtful questions about his research, offered relevant observations about his scholarly theories, and shared enough of her own intellectual interests to demonstrate that she could be the kind of companion he described. The conversation continued long after other guests had departed, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that felt both natural and significant. When Claudius finally took his leave, he had invited Messalina to visit his private library to examine manuscripts that related to their evening's discussion. The invitation was presented as a scholarly collaboration, but both participants understood its broader implications. For Messalina, it represented the successful completion of the first phase of her carefully planned campaign. For Claudius, it offered the possibility of finding in this remarkable young woman the intellectual and emotional partnership that had eluded him throughout his adult life. The days that followed their initial encounter established a pattern of interaction that gradually deepened their relationship while maintaining the appearances appropriate to their respective positions. Messalina's visits to Claudius's library became regular occurrences, always focused on legitimate scholarly activities, but creating opportunities for extended private conversation that revealed increasingly personal aspects of their thoughts and feelings. The library itself was a wonder that reflected both Claudius's intellectual passions and his access to resources unavailable to other scholars. Scrolls and codices filled specially constructed shelves that protected ancient documents from dampness and insects while making them easily accessible for research. The collection included not just Roman historical works, but Greek philosophical texts, Egyptian astronomical calculations, and documents from various conquered territories that provided insights into the diverse cultures that comprised the empire. During these visits, Messalina demonstrated the full extent of her educational preparation and natural intelligence. She could discuss the finer points of Greek rhetoric, analyze the economic implications of various tax policies, and offer informed opinions about military strategy based on her study of historical campaigns. But perhaps more importantly, she proved herself to be a genuinely engaged listener who encouraged Claudius to share his most ambitious intellectual projects and his private concerns about the empire's future. Their conversations ranged across topics that revealed the breadth of Claudius's interests and the depth of Messalina's preparation for this relationship. They discussed the challenges of governing diverse populations across vast distances, the economic pressures created by maintaining large military forces on multiple frontiers, and the political tensions that arose when traditional Roman institutions struggled to adapt to the realities of imperial administration. These discussions were themselves a form of courtship that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, they appeared to be scholarly collaborations between two intellectuals who shared common interests and complementary expertise. But beneath this academic facade, they were engaged in the delicate process of evaluating each other as potential life partners who would need to navigate the unique challenges of marriage within the imperial family. Claudius found in Messalina not just beauty and intelligence, but the kind of political sophistication that could make her a valuable ally in the complex maneuvering that characterized life at the highest levels of Roman society. Her family connections provided access to information and influence that could complement his own position within the imperial household. Her youth and energy offered the possibility of children who might secure his place in the succession, while providing him with the domestic happiness that had previously eluded him. For Messalina, these extended conversations provided unprecedented access to the inner workings of imperial decision-making and the private thoughts of someone who might soon wield enormous power. She learned about the financial pressures that constrained imperial policy, the military challenges that threatened frontier stability, and the personal relationships that often determined the success or failure of important initiatives. More importantly, she began to understand how she might position herself to influence these decisions once she became part of the imperial family. The physical attraction that developed between them added another dimension to their relationship that made their eventual marriage seem both politically advantageous and personally satisfying. Despite the significant age difference and Claudius's physical limitations, Messalina found herself genuinely drawn to his intellectual vitality and emotional vulnerability. His appreciation for her mind and his obvious need for companionship created a dynamic that satisfied her desire for influence while appealing to aspects of her personality that transcended mere ambition. As winter approached and their relationship deepened, the question of marriage began to emerge in their conversations with increasing frequency and specificity. Claudius spoke more openly about his desire for a wife who could share his intellectual interests and support his political responsibilities.
Messalina responded with carefully calibrated expressions of interest that encouraged his hopes, while maintaining the modesty expected of a young woman from a respectable family. The formal negotiations that would determine their future began during a series of carefully orchestrated meetings between their respective families. These discussions involved not just questions of dowry and financial arrangements, but complex calculations about political alliance, social status, and the potential implications of such a marriage for the broader stability of the imperial succession. The negotiations proceeded with the ritualistic precision that governed all significant marriages among Rome's elite. But beneath the formal discussions lay currents of ambition and calculation that would reshape the empire itself. Messalina's mother, Dacia Lepeda, approached these meetings with the strategic mind of a general planning a crucial campaign. She understood that her daughter's marriage to Claudius represented far more than a union between two individuals. It was an investment in the future of their family's political influence, a gamble that could elevate them to unprecedented heights of power or destroy them entirely if circumstances shifted against their favor. The morning preparations for these negotiation sessions began before dawn in the family's private chambers, where mother and daughter reviewed every detail of their strategy. Doña Laida had spent decades observing the rise and fall of noble families, learning to recognize the subtle signs that indicated which alliances would prosper and which would lead to exile or execution. Her guidance during this crucial period reflected not just maternal concern, but the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had survived the dangerous currents of imperial politics through careful planning and flawless execution. The financial discussions required particular delicacy, as both families needed to demonstrate their wealth and status while avoiding any appearance of desperation or excessive eagerness. Messalina's dowry was carefully calculated to reflect her family's ancient lineage and current prosperity without suggesting that they were attempting to purchase imperial favor through monetary incentives. The negotiations included not just immediate payments, but complex arrangements involving property transfers, business partnerships, and future inheritance rights that would bind the families together in ways that transcended the personal relationship between bride and groom. But the most sensitive aspects of these negotiations involve questions of political alignment and mutual support that could not be discussed openly, but had to be understood by all parties. Claudius needed assurance that marriage to Messalina would provide him with access to her family's extensive network of allies and information sources throughout the Senate and provincial administration. Messalina's family required confidence that their investment in this relationship would yield tangible benefits in terms of government appointments, commercial opportunities, and protection from potential political attacks. The ceremonial aspects of their courtship unfolded according to traditions that had governed Roman marriages for centuries, but every gesture carried contemporary political significance that made their relationship a subject of intense speculation throughout the city. When Claudius began appearing at public events with Messalina at his side, observers noted not just her beauty and grace, but the obvious intellectual connection between them that suggested a partnership based on genuine compatibility rather than mere political convenience. Their attendance at theatrical performances in Marcellus's theater created opportunities for public display that reinforced their emerging status as a significant political alliance. Messalina's selection of jewelry and clothing for these occasions required careful consideration of the messages being communicated to various audiences. Her appearance needed to suggest both personal confidence and appropriate deference to Claudius's superior social position. The subtle details of her presentation conveyed information about her family's resources, their cultural sophistication, and their understanding of the protocols that govern behavior at the highest levels of Roman society. The private dinners that punctuated their courtship provided settings for more intimate conversations that revealed the personal dimensions of their relationship while allowing both families to evaluate the practical implications of their union. These gatherings took place in carefully neutral locations that avoided any suggestion of presumption about the outcome of their negotiations. The guest lists were strategically composed to include individuals whose opinions would influence broader acceptance of the marriage within their social circle. During these meals, Messalina demonstrated her ability to navigate complex social situations with the same skills she brought to scholarly discussions. She engaged senators in conversations about legislative priorities, charmed military commanders with informed questions about frontier conditions, and impressed wealthy merchants with her understanding of commercial relationships that connected Rome to the broader Mediterranean world. These performances were not mere displays of social accomplishment, but practical demonstrations of her readiness to assume the responsibilities that would come with marriage to a member of the imperial family. The conversations between Messalina and Claudius during this period revealed their growing mutual understanding and the deepening emotional connection that made their marriage seem inevitable to everyone who observed them together. He spoke with increasing openness about his frustrations with the current imperial administration and his hopes for contributing to governmental reform if circumstances ever provided him with greater authority. She responded with insights that demonstrated both her political sophistication and her genuine interest in supporting his ambitions. Their discussions about literature and history continued to provide a foundation for their relationship, but gradually expanded to include more practical topics related to administration, diplomacy, and military affairs. Claudius found in Messalina a partner who could understand the complexities of imperial governance while offering fresh perspectives that challenged his assumptions and enriched his thinking. She discovered in him a mentor who could provide access to information and influence far beyond what her family connections had previously made available.
The physical intimacy that developed between them added emotional depth to their political partnership, while creating personal bonds that would influence their future decisions in ways that neither fully anticipated. Despite the significant age difference and the formal constraints that governed their courtship, they found themselves genuinely attracted to each other in ways that transcended the calculated aspects of their relationship. This personal connection would prove to be both a source of strength and a vulnerability as they navigated the treacherous waters of imperial politics together. As their wedding day approached, the preparations took on the character of a state celebration that reflected both their personal significance and their broader political importance. The ceremony would mark not just the union of two individuals, but the formal alliance between families that represented different aspects of Roman power and influence. The guest list included senators, military commanders, provincial governors, and foreign dignitaries whose presence would validate the marriage while creating opportunities for the kind of networking that sustained political careers. The morning of the ceremony began with rituals that connected their union to the religious traditions that provided legitimacy for Roman political authority. Messalina's preparation involved not just the usual attention to physical beauty, but participation in sacrifices and prayers that invoked divine blessing for their marriage and their future role in governing the empire. The selection of her wedding garments required consideration of both aesthetic impact and symbolic meaning, as every detail would be scrutinized by observers seeking clues about the new dynamics being created within the imperial family. The ceremony itself unfolded in the magnificent atrium of Claudius's residence, surrounded by marble statues that depicted the achievements of his ancestors, and frescoes that illustrated the divine favor that supposedly guided Roman destiny. The traditional vows were spoken with particular solemnity, as both bride and groom understood that they were making commitments that extended far beyond their personal relationship, to encompass responsibilities that would affect the welfare of millions of people throughout the empire. The wedding feast that followed provided the new couple with their first opportunity to function together as hosts of a major political gathering. Messalina's performance during this crucial event demonstrated her readiness to assume the social responsibilities that came with her new status.
She moved gracefully between different groups of guests, ensuring that conversations flowed smoothly while gathering information about the various political currents that swirled through the assembled company. The gifts presented during the celebration reflected both the wealth of the guests and their calculations about the future importance of their relationship with the new imperial couple. Senators offered rare books and artistic treasures that acknowledged Claudius's scholarly interests while suggesting their own cultural sophistication. Military commanders presented weapons and armor that emphasized their respect for imperial authority and their hopes for continued advancement under whatever regime might emerge from current political uncertainties. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the wedding celebration was the opportunity it provided for Messalina to observe the complex web of relationships that connected the various power centers within Roman society. She watched carefully as different groups of guests interacted, noting which alliances seemed strong and which appeared vulnerable to the kinds of pressures that might emerge during future political crises. These observations would prove invaluable as she began to develop her own strategies for building influence within the imperial household. The weeks that followed their marriage established patterns of daily life that would characterize their relationship throughout the turbulent years ahead. Their mornings began with private discussions about the previous day's political developments and the challenges that lay ahead. Claudius shared information about imperial policy debates, military situations, and diplomatic negotiations that provided Messalina with unprecedented insight into the decision-making processes that governed the empire. These morning conversations became opportunities for Messalina to offer observations and suggestions that gradually established her role as a trusted advisor whose opinions carried weight in their private discussions. She demonstrated her ability to analyze complex political situations, identify potential problems before they became crises, and propose solutions that reflected both practical wisdom and strategic insight. Claudius found her contributions increasingly valuable as he struggled to navigate the dangerous currents of imperial politics during the final years of Caligula's increasingly unstable reign. Their afternoon activities typically involved receiving visitors who sought access to imperial favor through their connection to Claudius. These meetings provided Messalina with extensive opportunities to study the personalities and motivations of individuals who wielded significant influence throughout the empire. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated which petitioners were trustworthy and which might pose threats to their interests. More importantly, she began to understand how information and influence flowed through the informal networks that often determined the success or failure of official government policies. The evening hours brought different challenges as they attended social gatherings that served as forums for the kind of political maneuvering that shaped imperial decision-making. These events required Messalina to balance multiple objectives simultaneously. She needed to support Claudius's political interests while building her own network of allies and information sources. She had to maintain the dignity appropriate to her new status while remaining accessible to individuals whose cooperation might prove valuable in future crises. Her success in managing these complex social situations reflected both her natural intelligence and the careful preparation that had characterized her approach to marriage with Claudius. She understood that her position as his wife provided her with opportunities for influence that no Roman woman had previously possessed. But she also recognized that these opportunities came with risks that required constant vigilance and strategic thinking. The transformation in her daily routine following
marriage revealed the extent to which her new status had elevated her within Roman society. The simple fact of her connection to the imperial family meant that her opinions on various subjects carried weight that extended far beyond her personal knowledge or expertise. Senators sought her views on legislative proposals. Military commanders valued her insights into imperial priorities. Wealthy merchants courted her favor in hopes of securing advantageous commercial arrangements. This sudden elevation to a position of significant influence might have overwhelmed someone less prepared for its responsibilities and dangers. But Messalina approached her new role with the same systematic intelligence that had characterized her preparation for marriage to Claudius. She established routines for gathering and analyzing information, created networks for monitoring political developments throughout the empire, and developed strategies for building and maintaining the alliances that would be essential for protecting their interests during whatever crisis might emerge from the increasingly unstable political situation. As the seasons turned, and Messalina settled into her new role as wife to the emperor's nephew, she began to understand that her marriage was merely the first step in a much larger game. The year 39 CE brought with it whispers of instability that echoed through the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill like distant thunder, promising storms to come. Emperor Caligula's behavior had grown increasingly erratic, his decisions more unpredictable, and his treatment of the Senate more openly contemptuous with each passing month. Messalina's mornings now began in chambers that reflected her elevated status within the imperial household. Her private apartments, located in a wing of Claudius's residence that overlooked the forum, were decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from Greek mythology that spoke of transformation and divine favor. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of power and possibility as she prepared each day for the delicate work of expanding her influence within the complex ecosystem of imperial politics. The ritual of her morning toilet had evolved to accommodate her new responsibilities and opportunities. Her personal slaves, now numbering more than a dozen, attended to every detail of her appearance, with the understanding that their mistress was no longer simply a noblewoman, but a potential bridge to imperial favor for anyone clever enough to earn her goodwill. The selection of her daily attire required consideration of multiple audiences and objectives, as her appearance would be scrutinized by everyone from senators seeking political advantage to foreign diplomats attempting to gauge the stability of the current regime. Her jewelry collection had expanded dramatically following her marriage, not merely through Claudius's generosity, but through the calculated gifts of individuals who understood that access to imperial favor often depended on maintaining positive relationships with family members who possessed the emperor's ear. Each piece told a story of alliance or obligation that Messalina catalogued carefully in her memory. A sapphire necklace from the governor of Syria suggested his desire for continued imperial support in managing frontier tensions. Emerald earrings from a wealthy merchant family in Alexandria indicated their hope for favorable consideration of trade agreements that could affect their commercial empire. The morning briefings that had once focused on general political developments now included detailed intelligence about specific threats and opportunities that required immediate attention. Her network of information sources had expanded exponentially through her marriage, as servants throughout the imperial household recognized that sharing valuable intelligence with Claudius's wife might prove more rewarding than maintaining traditional loyalties to their original masters. Through her personal slave, Pythus, who had cultivated relationships with other servants in imperial residences, Messalina learned about private conversations between Caligula and his closest advisors. These reports painted an increasingly disturbing picture of an emperor whose grip on reality was loosening with each passing day. She heard accounts of midnight meetings where Caligula issued contradictory orders to different officials, apparently forgetting previous conversations entirely. More troubling were reports of the emperor's growing paranoia about potential threats from within his own family, suspicions that could easily encompass Claudius despite his apparent lack of political ambition. The intelligence gathering extended beyond simple eavesdrops to include systematic analysis of behavioral patterns and political trends that might indicate approaching crisis. Messalina established a private correspondence with women in other noble families who served as informal observers of their husbands' political activities. These letters, disguised as social communications about fashion, literature, and domestic concerns, actually contained coded information about troop movements, senatorial debates, and financial arrangements that provided early warning of developing problems.
These meetings were themselves exercises in the kind of strategic thinking that Messalina was developing as she prepared for whatever role she might need to play in future political upheavals. She learned to think several moves ahead, considering how current developments might create opportunities or threats months or even years in the future. Her analysis of the political landscape began to resemble the work of a military strategist planning for multiple contingencies rather than simply reacting to immediate circumstances. The afternoon hours brought different challenges as Messalina began to receive visitors in her own right rather than simply accompanying Claudius to meetings with his political contacts. Her reception rooms became informal centers of information exchange, where senators, military officers, and provincial administrators could discuss sensitive topics with greater freedom than was possible in more official settings. These gatherings were carefully orchestrated to appear social while actually serving crucial political functions. The conversations that took place during these afternoon receptions provided Messalina with detailed understanding of the pressures and concerns that were shaping policy decisions throughout the empire. She learned about grain shortages in Egypt that could affect food supplies in Rome, military setbacks in Germania that were being concealed from public knowledge, and diplomatic complications with Parthia that threatened to explode into open warfare. More importantly, she began to understand how these various challenges were interconnected and how skilled political maneuvering might transform apparent problems into opportunities for advancement. Her approach to hosting these gatherings reflected the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that she had been developing since childhood. She learned to create atmospheres that encourage confidential communications while maintaining plausible deniability about the political significance of the information being shared. Her guests found themselves speaking more openly than they had intended, revealing concerns and ambitions that provided valuable intelligence about their likely behavior during future crises. The physical arrangement of her reception rooms was itself a tool for gathering information and building influence. The placement of couches and tables created natural conversation areas that could be monitored discreetly while appearing to offer privacy for sensitive discussions. Carefully positioned servants could overhear important conversations while appearing to attend to routine domestic tasks. The selection and training of these servants required the same attention to detail that generals devoted to choosing and preparing their most trusted scouts. The entertainment provided during these gatherings served multiple purposes beyond simple hospitality. Musical performances created background noise that made eavesdropping more difficult, while establishing an atmosphere of cultural sophistication that appealed to her educated guests. Poetry readings provided opportunities to communicate subtle messages through the selection of particular texts that might carry political significance for informed audiences. Even the food and wine were chosen to create specific impressions about wealth, taste, and political alignment. But perhaps most importantly, these afternoon receptions allowed Messalina to begin building the personal relationships that would prove essential when the current political order inevitably collapsed. She identified individuals whose talents and ambitions aligned with her own objectives, while maintaining the flexibility to adjust her alliances as circumstances changed. Her ability to inspire both loyalty and useful indiscretion in her guests reflected skills that had been years in the making, but were only now finding their proper expression. The evening hours brought yet another set of opportunities and challenges as Messalina accompanied Claudius to the formal dinners and cultural events that served as forums for the highest levels of imperial politics. These gatherings brought together the most powerful individuals in the empire under circumstances that encouraged the kind of informal communication that often proved more significant than official policy debates. Her presence at these events, as Claudius's wife, provided her with access to conversations and information that would have been impossible to obtain through any other means. She could observe the personal dynamics between key political figures while listening to discussions about military strategy, economic policy, and diplomatic negotiations that shaped the empire's future. More subtly, she could influence these discussions through carefully timed comments and questions that guided conversations toward topics that served her intelligence-gathering objectives. The social protocols that governed these formal gatherings created opportunities for the kind of complex maneuvering that Messalina was learning to master. The arrangement of dining couches, the order of toasts, and even the selection of conversation topics all carried political significance that informed observers could decode to understand shifting alliances and emerging tensions.
Her ability to navigate these subtleties while appearing to focus on conventional social pleasantries demonstrated the sophisticated political education she had been receiving and her natural talent for strategic thinking. The late evening hours, after the formal events had concluded and other guests had departed, often brought the most valuable opportunities for private conversation with individuals whose cooperation might prove crucial during future crises. These intimate discussions, conducted in settings that encouraged personal revelation, provided Messalina with insights into the fears, ambitions, and vulnerabilities that motivated the empire's most powerful figures. Her skill in creating and managing these private conversations reflected her understanding that political intelligence was most valuable when it revealed the human motivations behind official positions. She learned to recognize the signs of genuine conviction versus mere expedience, to identify which individuals could be trusted and which required constant surveillance, and to understand how personal relationships might influence political decisions during moments of crisis. The networks of alliance and information that Messalina was building extended far beyond Rome itself to include contacts
throughout the provinces who could provide early warning of potential rebellions, economic disruptions, or foreign threats that might affect imperial stability. Her correspondence with governors' wives and the female relatives of military commanders created an informal intelligence system that supplemented and sometimes contradicted the official reports that reached the imperial court through conventional channels. These provincial connections proved particularly valuable as reports began to arrive suggesting that Caligula's erratic behavior was creating dangerous instability in regions where imperial authority depended on consistent policy and reliable support from Rome. Provincial governors were struggling to maintain order while implementing contradictory instructions from an emperor whose decisions seemed to change daily. Military commanders were uncertain about their authority to respond to local threats without explicit imperial approval that might never arrive or might be reversed without warning. The information flowing through Messalina's networks painted a picture of an empire under increasing strain from the incompetence of its supreme leader. Tax collection was becoming irregular as provincial administrators hesitated to implement policies that might be reversed before they could be completed. Trade relationships with foreign kingdoms were suffering as diplomatic communications became unreliable and treaty obligations were ignored or forgotten. Most dangerously, the loyalty of frontier legions was being tested by supply shortages and unclear strategic objectives that made effective military operations increasingly difficult. As winter approached and Caligula's behavior became even more unpredictable, Messalina began to understand that the political crisis she had been preparing for was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate threat that required decisive action. The intelligence she had been gathering suggested that the current regime could not survive much longer, and that the succession question would need to be resolved through means that might include violence, civil war, or foreign intervention. Her analysis of the various factors that would determine the outcome of the approaching crisis led her to focus increasingly on Claudius's potential role in whatever government might emerge from the collapse of Caligula's rule. His position within the imperial family, his scholarly reputation, and his apparent lack of political ambition made him an attractive candidate for individuals who wanted stability without the threat of future tyranny. More importantly, his marriage to her provided access to intelligence networks and political alliances that could prove decisive during the chaotic transition that would follow Caligula's inevitable downfall. The preparations that Messalina began making during this period reflected both her understanding of the approaching crisis and her determination to position herself and Claudius to benefit from whatever opportunities might emerge. She quietly strengthened her relationships with key military officers who might play crucial roles in determining the succession. She expanded her information networks to include sources within the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty would be essential for any successful claimant to imperial power.
Most importantly, she began developing contingency plans that would allow her to protect her family's interests regardless of how the political situation ultimately resolved itself. The winter months brought increasingly ominous signs that the empire was approaching a point of no return under Caligula's leadership. Reports from the frontiers suggested that foreign enemies were beginning to test Roman resolve through increased raiding and diplomatic provocations. Economic indicators pointed toward potential shortages of essential supplies that could trigger popular unrest in Rome itself. Most alarming of all were reports from within the imperial court suggesting that Caligula's paranoia was focusing increasingly on potential threats from his own family members. As the new year dawned, Messalina understood that the moment she had been preparing for throughout her marriage was rapidly approaching. The skills she had developed, the alliances she had built, and the intelligence network she had created would soon be tested in ways that would determine not just her personal fate, but the future direction of the Roman Empire itself. The teenage girl who had entered imperial politics through strategic marriage was about to discover whether her preparation had been sufficient to navigate the most dangerous political crisis of her generation. The stage was set for events that would transform the Roman world forever, and Messalina found herself positioned at the very center of the storm that was about to break over the Palatine Hill. Everything she had learned about power, politics, and survival was about to be tested in the ultimate examination of her abilities and ambitions. The morning of January 24, 41 CE, began like countless others in the imperial palace, with servants moving through marble corridors carrying oil for lamps and fresh water for the morning rituals. But by evening, the Roman world would be forever changed, and Messalina would find herself thrust into a position of power that exceeded even her most ambitious dreams. The assassination of Caligula unfolded with brutal efficiency in the underground passages beneath the theater where he had been attending the Palatine Games. The conspiracy, months in the planning, involved members of the Praetorian Guard who had grown tired of serving an emperor whose madness threatened the stability of their own positions. When the news reached Claudius, he was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that he too would be marked for death as part of a general purge of the imperial family. Messalina received word of the emperor's death while receiving guests in her afternoon reception room. The information delivered by a breathless slave whose trembling voice barely managed to convey the magnitude of what had occurred. Her immediate response demonstrated the political instincts she had been developing throughout her marriage. Rather than succumbing to panic or rushing to find Claudius, she calmly dismissed her guests with explanations about a sudden family emergency, then systematically activated the information network she had spent months cultivating. Her first priority was gathering accurate intelligence about the scope of the conspiracy and the intentions of its participants. Through her network of servant contacts, she learned that the assassination had been limited to Caligula himself, with no immediate plans for eliminating other family members. More crucially, she discovered that the Praetorian Guard was divided about the succession, with some officers favoring a return to republican government, while others sought a new emperor who could provide
stability without tyranny. The afternoon hours brought a steady stream of messengers carrying reports from throughout the city as word of the emperor's death spread, and various factions began positioning themselves for the power struggle that would determine Rome's future. Messalina's reception rooms became an informal command center where information was gathered, analyzed, and transformed into strategic intelligence that would guide their response to the unfolding crisis. The reports painted a picture of organized chaos as different groups attempted to seize control of key installations throughout the capital. The Senate had convened an emergency session to debate the possibility of restoring republican government, with several prominent members arguing that Caligula's death provided an opportunity to end the imperial system entirely. Meanwhile, various military commanders were moving troops to secure strategic positions while they evaluated which course of action would best serve their interests. Most significantly, Messalina learned that a substantial faction within the Praetorian Guard was actively searching for Claudius,
with the intention of proclaiming him emperor. Their reasoning was practical rather than sentimental. Claudius represented continuity with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, while offering the prospect of competent administration that could restore stability to imperial governance. His scholarly reputation and apparent political weakness made him seem manageable to military officers who wanted an emperor they could influence rather than one who might threaten their positions. The discovery that Claudius was being actively sought by potential supporters transformed Messalina's strategic calculations entirely. Rather than focusing on survival during a period of political chaos, she suddenly found herself confronted with the possibility that her husband might become the most powerful man on earth within a matter of hours. This prospect required immediate reconsideration of their priorities and rapid implementation of plans that had been developed as distant contingencies. Her response to this extraordinary opportunity demonstrated both her political sophistication and her understanding of the narrow window of time available for decisive action. She dispatched trusted slaves to locate Claudius and bring him to their private chambers, where they could discuss their response to the unfolding situation without interference from other family members or potential rivals. Simultaneously, she activated her networks within the palace staff to gather intelligence about the movements and intentions of other imperial family members who might compete for power during the succession crisis. The reunion with Claudius revealed the extent to which the day's events had overwhelmed his ability to process their implications or respond strategically to the opportunities they presented. He was found in a storage room near the imperial library, having hidden there when news of the assassination first reached the palace. His terror was genuine and understandable, as previous imperial successions had often involved the systematic elimination of potential rivals to ensure the security of new regimes. Messalina's management of this crucial conversation required all the diplomatic skills she had developed during their marriage. She needed to calm Claudius's fears while helping him understand the unique nature of their situation and the decisive action that would be required to capitalize on the opportunity that had suddenly presented itself. Her approach combined emotional support with strategic analysis, acknowledging his legitimate concerns while gradually building his confidence about their ability to navigate the crisis successfully. The intelligence reports she shared during their private discussion revealed that the political situation was more favorable to their interests than Claudius had dared to imagine. The Praetorian Guard factions seeking to install him as emperor represented a substantial military force that could provide the physical security necessary to claim and maintain imperial power. The Senate's Republican dreams were unlikely to survive contact with the practical realities of governing an empire that had grown too large and complex for traditional Republican institutions. More importantly, Messalina had identified potential allies among the palace staff, military officers, and civilian administrators who could provide crucial support during the initial transition period. Her years of careful relationship building had created a network of individuals who owed their positions or prosperity to her family's influence and who would benefit from supporting Claudius's claim to imperial authority. The strategic discussion that followed addressed both immediate tactical concerns and long-term considerations that would determine their success or failure as imperial rulers. Claudius needed to project confidence and competence while avoiding any appearance of having conspired in Caligula's assassination. He would need to offer appropriate incentives to ensure Praetorian loyalty while maintaining support from other military units whose cooperation would be essential for preventing civil war. Messalina's role in this transition required careful definition to maximize her influence while avoiding the kind of public prominence that might threaten traditional Roman sensibilities about female participation in government. She would need to function as an informal advisor and information coordinator while maintaining the appearance of dutiful wedlock submission that was expected of imperial women. The evening hours brought the culmination of the day's extraordinary events, as representatives of the Praetorian Guard formally approached Claudius with their offer of imperial power. The delegation was led by officers whose names Messalina recognized from her intelligence networks, men whose motivations and reliability she had been evaluating for months in preparation for exactly this type of crisis. The formal ceremony that followed was both improvised and steeped in tradition, as the Praetorian officers proclaimed Claudius emperor while he stood in the same palace where his nephew had been murdered hours earlier. The symbolism was unmistakable. The imperial system would continue, but under leadership that promised competence and stability, rather than the chaos that had characterized Caligula's final years.
Messalina's presence during this historic moment marked her transformation from the wife of a minor imperial family member to the empress of the Roman world. Her careful preparation had positioned her to play a crucial role in one of the most significant political transitions in Roman history. The networks she had built, the intelligence she had gathered, and the relationships she had cultivated had all contributed to ensuring that this transition occurred smoothly and in ways that maximized their family's benefit. The immediate aftermath of Claudius's accession to imperial power created new challenges and opportunities that would test every skill Messalina had developed during her political education. As empress, she would need to navigate a complex web of expectations, traditions, and practical necessities that would determine both her personal influence and the broader success of their administration. Her first priority was establishing the informal structures that would allow her to continue gathering intelligence and exercising influence while maintaining the appearances appropriate to her new status. The transformation of her personal household into an extension of the imperial administration required careful planning and skilled personnel management that could accommodate both traditional protocols and the practical necessities of effective governance. The selection and training of her personal staff became a crucial element in building the foundation for her future influence. She needed individuals who could serve conventional domestic functions while also acting as intelligence gatherers, message carriers, and informal diplomatic representatives when circumstances required. The expansion of her household staff provided opportunities to place trusted allies in positions where they could monitor developments throughout the imperial court while appearing to serve purely ceremonial functions. The physical transformation of her living quarters reflected both her elevated status and her practical requirements for conducting the informal business of empire. Her private chambers were redecorated to accommodate the increased volume of visitors, while creating spaces where sensitive conversations could take place without fear of eavesdropping. The installation of new security measures ensured that her communications remained private, while providing early warning of potential threats to their safety or political position. The daily routines that had characterized her life as Claudius's wife required complete reorganization to accommodate the responsibilities and opportunities that came with imperial power. Her morning preparations now included briefings on overnight developments throughout the empire, analysis of intelligence reports from provincial administrators, and strategic planning sessions that would guide their approach to the day's political challenges. The transformation of her afternoon receptions into crucial elements of imperial governance required sophisticated understanding of both ceremonial protocols and practical necessities. These gatherings now attracted senators, military commanders, and foreign diplomats, whose attendance reflected their recognition of her influence within the new administration. The conversations that took place during these events shaped policy decisions and diplomatic relationships that affected millions of people throughout the Mediterranean world. Her ability to influence these conversations through carefully timed interventions demonstrated the sophisticated political skills she had been developing since childhood. The networks of alliance and information that Messalina had built during her preparation for power now required expansion and refinement to meet the challenges of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates River. Her correspondence with provincial administrators, military commanders, and local leaders throughout the Roman world became an essential element of imperial communication that supplemented and sometimes contradicted official government channels.
The intelligence flowing through these networks provided early warning of potential problems while creating opportunities for preventative action that could maintain stability without resorting to military force. Her ability to identify emerging threats and develop appropriate responses demonstrated the value of the systematic approach to information gathering that she had been perfecting throughout her political career. As the first months of Claudius's reign unfolded, Messalina found herself wielding influence that exceeded anything previously achieved by a Roman woman, while maintaining the careful balance between power and propriety that would be essential for long-term success. The teenage girl who had entered imperial politics through strategic marriage had become the most powerful woman in the ancient world, positioned to shape the destiny of an empire through intelligence, ambition, and political skill that had been years in the making. The daily rhythms of imperial life provided constant opportunities to exercise this influence, while building the foundation for even greater authority in the years ahead. Every conversation, every decision, every carefully calculated gesture contributed to the complex process of transforming personal power into lasting institutional change that would affect the Roman world for generations to come.
The morning sun that rose over the 7 hills of Rome now illuminated an empire where a woman's voice carried unprecedented weight in determining the fate of nations. Messalina had achieved the impossible, but her greatest challenges still lay ahead as she prepared to test the limits of female power within the masculine world of Roman imperial politics. The transformation from emperor's wife to empress brought with it a daily schedule that would have exhausted lesser mortals. But for Messalina, each hour presented new opportunities to weave her influence deeper into the fabric of imperial governance. Her mornings began in the pre-dawn darkness, when the palace still slept, and only the most trusted servants moved through corridors lit by flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on marble walls adorned with scenes of conquest and triumph. The ritual of preparing for each day had evolved into something approaching a military operation, with every detail carefully orchestrated to project the precise combination of imperial dignity and accessible charm that her position required. Her personal chambers, now befitting an empress, occupied an entire wing of the palace complex, with windows that overlooked both the bustling forum below and the private gardens where she could conduct the most sensitive conversations away from curious ears. The selection of her daily attire had become a form of silent communication that conveyed messages to different audiences throughout the empire. When receiving senators, she chose garments that emphasized tradition and continuity with Roman values. For meetings with military commanders, her clothing suggested strength and resolution. When entertaining foreign dignitaries, her appearance reflected the wealth and sophistication of Roman civilization, while acknowledging their own cultural traditions through subtle details that demonstrated respect without submission. Her personal jewelry collection now included pieces that served practical as well as aesthetic functions. Hidden compartments in elaborate brooches could conceal written messages that needed to be transmitted without detection. Rings bore seals that could authenticate documents or communications sent through her private networks. Even her hairstyles were chosen to accommodate small ornaments that might contain coded information or serve as signals to Confederates positioned throughout the palace complex. The morning briefings that shaped her understanding of daily challenges had expanded to include reports from every corner of the known world. Intelligence flowed in from Britain, where Roman legions struggled to pacify hostile tribes in misty forests that seemed to swallow entire cohorts. Updates arrived from the Rhine frontier, where Germanic warriors tested Roman defenses with increasing boldness. Dispatches from the eastern provinces detailed the complex negotiations required to maintain peace with Parthian kingdoms that controlled crucial trade routes to India and China. But perhaps most valuable were the domestic intelligence reports that revealed the shifting currents of opinion and alliance within Rome itself. Through her network of household servants, freed men and carefully cultivated friendships among the wives of prominent officials, Messalina maintained awareness of every significant conversation that took place in the city's noble quarters. She knew which senators were meeting privately to discuss potential opposition to Claudius's policies, which military officers might be harboring Republican sympathies, and which wealthy merchants were attempting to manipulate grain supplies for personal profit. The processing and analysis of this constant stream of information required mental discipline that few people possessed. Messalina had trained herself to compartmentalize different types of intelligence while identifying patterns and connections that might escape less systematic observers. She maintained detailed mental maps of relationships between hundreds of individuals, tracking their shifting loyalties and evolving ambitions with the precision of a master strategist, planning multiple campaigns simultaneously. Her breakfast meetings had become informal councils of state, where the most pressing issues of imperial governance were debated and resolved through conversations that appeared casual but actually determined policy affecting millions of lives. These gatherings took place in a private dining room decorated with frescoes depicting scenes from Greek mythology that reminded participants of the divine favor supposedly enjoyed by Roman rulers, while subtly suggesting the fate that awaited those who challenged imperial authority. The guest list for these morning sessions were carefully curated to bring together individuals whose expertise and perspectives could illuminate different aspects of complex problems. A typical breakfast might include a military engineer discussing bridge construction in Gaul, a merchant prince explaining fluctuations in silk prices from China, and a legal scholar analyzing the implications of extending Roman citizenship to provincial populations. Messalina orchestrated these conversations with subtle skill, guiding discussions toward conclusions that served imperial interests while allowing participants to feel that they were contributing meaningfully to important decisions. Her own contributions to these policy discussions revealed the depth of knowledge she had acquired about every aspect of imperial administration. She could discuss the technical details of aqueduct construction with engineers, debate the finer points of commercial law with merchants, and analyze military strategy with generals who had spent decades in frontier campaigns. Her questions revealed understanding that impressed even cynical observers, who had initially dismissed her as merely a beautiful ornament to Claudius's reign. The mid-morning hours brought audiences with petitioners whose requests ranged from personal favors to matters affecting entire provinces. These meetings provided Messalina with direct insight into the concerns and challenges facing different segments of Roman society, while creating opportunities to build networks of obligation and gratitude that extended her influence far beyond the palace walls. A delegation of grain merchants might seek imperial intervention to resolve a dispute over shipping rates with a neighboring city. A censor might seek a promotion for a son serving at the frontier. A widow might be seeking justice against relatives who had tried to dispossess her of her inheritance. In each case, Messalina listened carefully and asked insightful questions before promising to act. But she concealed her inner thoughts and plans behind a facade of poise and professional decorum. Every interaction was a carefully calculated performance that aimed to enhance her influence and bolster Emperor Claudius's rule. And it's still coming up.
Disputes with provincial governors who were demanding excessive taxes that threatened their ability to supply Rome's massive population. Their petition would be heard with apparent sympathy, while Messalina gathered intelligence about local corruption and administrative incompetence that could be addressed through carefully targeted reforms. The merchants would leave believing they had gained a powerful advocate for their interests, while actually having provided valuable information that strengthened imperial control over provincial commerce. Veterans seeking land grants or pensions presented their cases with the dignity of men who had shed blood for Roman glory in distant campaigns against enemies whose names most civilians could not pronounce. Their stories of service in Britain's rain-soaked forests, Germania's frozen plains, and Africa's burning deserts provided Messalina with detailed understanding of military conditions throughout the empire, while creating personal connections with soldiers whose loyalty would be essential during any future crisis.
provincial delegations brought more complex requests that required sophisticated understanding of local politics and cultural traditions. Representatives from Greek cities sought confirmation of traditional privileges that had been threatened by overzealous Roman administrators. Celtic chieftains requested modifications to tribute arrangements that reflected changed economic conditions in their territories. Egyptian priests petitioned for resolution of disputes between traditional religious authorities and Roman officials who misunderstood the complex relationships between temples and local populations. Each of these encounters required Messalina to balance competing interests while projecting confidence in imperial justice and benevolence. Her responses needed to satisfy immediate concerns while serving longer-term strategic objectives that might not be apparent to the petitioners themselves. A seemingly minor adjustment to tax collection procedures in one province could set precedents that affected imperial revenues throughout the empire. A decision about religious practices in a single city could influence relationships with local populations across multiple continents. The afternoon hours brought different challenges, as Messalina received visits from the wives and female relatives of prominent officials whose social calls served important political functions beneath their veneer of feminine propriety. These gatherings took place in reception rooms designed to encourage intimate conversation while maintaining the dignity appropriate to imperial entertaining. The furniture was arranged to create natural conversation clusters, while ensuring that sensitive discussions could not be overheard by casual observers. The conversations that unfolded during these afternoon visits provided access to information and perspectives that would never appear in official reports or formal meetings. The wife of a provincial governor in Britannia might mention her husband's concerns about barbarian raids that were being underreported to avoid criticism from imperial headquarters. The daughter of a wealthy senator could reveal family financial difficulties that might affect her father's political reliability during future crises. The sister of a military commander might share gossip about troop morale that provided early warning of potential mutinies or loyalty problems. Messalina's skill in managing these social interactions reflected years of practice in extracting valuable intelligence while maintaining the appearance of casual friendship. She asked questions that seemed motivated by genuine interest rather than political calculation, offered advice that appeared helpful rather than manipulative, and shared confidences that created bonds of mutual obligation without revealing information that could compromise imperial interests. The refreshments served during these gatherings were chosen to create specific impressions about imperial wealth and sophistication, while accommodating the dietary preferences and cultural traditions of diverse guests. Delicacies from throughout the empire demonstrated Rome's global reach, while providing conversation topics that could lead to discussions of trade routes, provincial conditions, and local politics that might affect imperial policy. The quality of wines and exotic fruits served as subtle reminders of imperial power, while creating atmospheres of luxury that encouraged guests to speak more freely than they might in more formal settings. The physical arrangements of these afternoon receptions served multiple purposes beyond simple hospitality. Carefully positioned mirrors allowed discreet observation of conversations taking place in different areas of the room. Strategically placed servants could monitor discussions while appearing to attend to routine duties. The selection and training of these servants required the same attention to detail that military commanders devoted to choosing scouts and intelligence officers for crucial missions. Her personal correspondence occupied much of the late afternoon hours, as Messalina maintained extensive communications with contacts throughout the empire, who provided intelligence and carried out missions that could not be entrusted to official channels. These letters were masterpieces of coded communication that appeared to discuss routine social matters while actually conveying complex instructions and sensitive information about political developments that affected imperial security. A letter to the wife of a governor in Britannia might ostensibly discuss fashion trends and family news, while actually providing detailed instructions about intelligence gathering related to potential tribal uprisings.
Correspondence with female relatives of military commanders could appear to focus on domestic concerns while containing coded assessments of troop loyalty and strategic vulnerabilities that required immediate attention from imperial headquarters. The writing and encryption of these messages required skills that Messalina had been developing since her earliest days of political involvement. She had mastered multiple coding systems that allowed secure communication while maintaining plausible deniability if messages were intercepted
by hostile forces. Her personal secretary, a highly educated Greek freedwoman named Acte, possessed the linguistic skills necessary to compose letters in local dialects and cultural styles that would not arouse suspicion among provincial populations who might monitor communications with Rome. The evening hours brought the most visible aspects of Messalina's imperial role as she participated in formal dinners and cultural events that served crucial political functions beneath their veneer of entertainment and social refinement. These gatherings brought together the most powerful individuals in the empire under circumstances that encouraged the kind of informal interaction that often proved more significant than official meetings and formal negotiations. The great dining halls of the imperial palace provided settings for political theater that reinforced Roman power while creating opportunities for the subtle maneuvering that determined policy outcomes and personnel decisions. The arrangement of dining couches reflected careful calculation of status relationships and political alliances. The order of toasts acknowledged hierarchies while sending messages about imperial favor and displeasure. Even the selection of entertainment conveyed information about cultural values and political priorities that informed observers could interpret to understand current policy directions. Messalina's presence at these events served multiple functions that extended far beyond ceremonial representation. Her conversations with individual guests provided opportunities to gather intelligence, test policy proposals, and build personal relationships that could prove crucial during future crises. Her ability to move gracefully between different groups while maintaining awareness of multiple conversations simultaneously demonstrated political skills that impressed even experienced diplomats and military commanders. The topics discussed during these formal dinners ranged across every aspect of imperial governance and provided Messalina with comprehensive understanding of challenges and opportunities throughout the Roman world. Military commanders shared assessments of frontier conditions while debating strategic alternatives for addressing threats from Germanic tribes, Parthian kingdoms, and restive populations in recently conquered territories. Provincial administrators discussed economic conditions, tax collection difficulties, and infrastructure projects that affected trade routes connecting Rome to markets in India, China, and the mysterious lands beyond the northern forests. Cultural performances during these events served political as well as entertainment functions, as the selection of music, poetry, and dramatic presentations communicated messages about imperial values and priorities. Drake tragedies reminded audiences of the dangers of hubris while celebrating the triumph of justice over tyranny. Roman historical epics reinforced pride in imperial achievements while suggesting divine favor for continued expansion and conquest. Musical selections from various provinces acknowledged cultural diversity while demonstrating Rome's capacity to appreciate and incorporate the best elements of conquered civilizations. The late evening hours after formal events had concluded and most guests had departed often brought the most valuable opportunities for private conversations with key individuals whose cooperation was essential for successful implementation of imperial policies. These intimate discussions took place in smaller chambers designed to encourage personal revelation while maintaining appropriate dignity for high-level political negotiations. The intelligence gathered during these private conversations provided insights into personal motivations and hidden agendas that could not be detected through official channels. A senator might reveal private concerns about economic policies that could affect his family's business interests. A military commander could share confidential assessments of subordinate officers whose loyalty might be questionable. A provincial governor might describe local political dynamics that required careful management to prevent rebellions or administrative breakdowns. Messalina's skill in creating and managing these private conversations reflected her understanding that political intelligence was most valuable when it revealed the human factors behind official positions and public statements. She learned to recognize signs of genuine conviction versus mere expediency, to identify individuals whose support could be relied upon during crises, and to understand how personal relationships might influence political decisions during moments when traditional loyalties came under pressure. The networks of information and influence that these conversations created extended throughout the empire and provided early warning of potential problems while creating opportunities for preventative action that could maintain stability without resorting to military force. Her ability to coordinate responses to emerging challenges through informal communications often proved more effective than official government procedures that moved slowly and attracted unwanted attention to sensitive situations. As midnight approached and the palace finally settled into relative quiet, Messalina would retreat to her private chambers for the planning and analysis that prepared her for the following day's challenges. The intelligence gathered during the day's activities required systematic evaluation and integration into her comprehensive understanding of political trends and strategic opportunities throughout the empire. Her private study, accessible only through her personal chambers, contained maps, documents, and reference materials that provided detailed information about every significant political figure, military unit, and economic resource within Roman territory. The walls were covered with charts tracking troop movements, trade flows, and political developments that might affect imperial security or provide opportunities for expansion of Roman influence. The late-night hours brought the solitary work of processing information and developing strategies that would guide imperial policy while protecting and advancing her family's interests. This analysis required the kind of sustained intellectual effort that few people could maintain while managing the social and ceremonial demands of imperial life. Messalina had trained herself to compartmentalize different types of thinking while maintaining the mental agility necessary to switch between tasks quickly and efficiently.
Flexibility necessary to adapt quickly to unexpected developments. Her personal journals, written in a private code that only she could decipher, contained assessments of key individuals, analyses of political trends, and strategic plans that extended months or years into the future. These documents represented the accumulated wisdom of someone who understood the Roman political system more thoroughly than perhaps anyone else of her generation, male or female. The planning process that concluded each day involved reviewing immediate challenges while considering their implications for longer-term objectives that might require months or years to achieve. Each decision needed to serve multiple purposes while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected opportunities or threats that could emerge without warning from any corner of the empire. As she finally prepared for sleep in chambers that had once belonged to Augustus himself, Messalina could reflect on a day that had advanced her understanding and influence while positioning the empire for continued stability and growth under her informal guidance. The morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but also the confidence that came from systematic preparation and comprehensive understanding of the complex forces that shaped the destiny of the civilized world. The teenage girl who had entered imperial politics through strategic marriage had become the most influential woman in human history, wielding power that affected the daily lives of millions while building the foundation for even greater authority in the years ahead. Her transformation was complete, but her story was just beginning as she prepared to test the ultimate limits of what a brilliant and determined woman could achieve in the masculine world of imperial Rome. The dawn chorus of Rome's awakening streets provided a familiar soundtrack as Messalina's influence reached its zenith during the second year of Claudius's reign. Her private apartments had become an unofficial second seat of power, where decisions affecting millions were shaped through conversations that appeared casual but carried the weight of imperial decree. The marble floors bore the footsteps of senators, generals, and foreign ambassadors who understood that access to the empress often proved more valuable than formal audiences with the emperor himself. Her morning ritual now began before the first crowed, with trusted servants arriving in darkness to prepare chambers that would soon receive visitors whose conversations could determine the fate of distant provinces.
The process of selecting her daily appearance had evolved into strategic communication, where every detail, from the arrangement of her hair to the choice of gemstones, conveyed carefully calculated messages about imperial policy and personal favor. The transformation of her personal quarters reflected the expansion of her authority beyond anything previously achieved by a Roman woman. What had once been elegant domestic spaces now functioned as command centers where intelligence from across the known world was processed and analyzed. Maps covered entire walls, marked with colored pins that tracked troop movements, trade routes, and political developments that required constant monitoring and occasional intervention. Her correspondence alone required the services of multiple secretaries who worked in shifts to maintain communications with contacts spanning from the fog-shrouded forests of Britannia to the sun-baked cities of Egypt. Each letter required careful encoding to ensure that sensitive information could be transmitted without detection by potential enemies who might intercept imperial communications. The codes themselves were masterworks of complexity that appeared to discuss mundane social matters while actually conveying strategic intelligence and operational instructions. The morning briefings that shaped her daily priorities had expanded to include reports from sources that official imperial channels could never access. Household slaves in senatorial families provided intelligence about private conversations that revealed true attitudes toward imperial policies. Merchants traveling ancient trade routes brought news of economic conditions and political unrest in distant territories where Roman authority remained fragile. Military wives shared gossip that often contained more accurate assessments of troop morale than formal reports submitted through official channels. The processing of this constant information flow required mental capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Messalina had trained herself to maintain comprehensive awareness of hundreds of simultaneous situations, while identifying patterns and connections that might escape even experienced intelligence officers. Her ability to correlate seemingly unrelated events across vast distances often provided early warning of potential crises that could threaten imperial stability. Her breakfast meetings had evolved into informal councils, where the most critical decisions of imperial governance were debated and resolved through discussions that appeared spontaneous, but actually followed carefully orchestrated agendas. These gatherings brought together experts whose knowledge could illuminate different aspects of complex challenges facing the empire. A typical morning might include consultations with engineers planning aqueduct construction in distant provinces, merchants analyzing fluctuations in luxury goods markets, and legal scholars interpreting the implications of extending Roman law to newly conquered territories. The dining room, where these crucial conversations took place, had been redesigned to accommodate both intimate discussion and strategic security. Hidden alcoves allowed trusted observers to monitor conversations without being detected. Specially trained servants could overhear sensitive discussions while appearing to attend to routine domestic duties. The furniture itself was arranged to create natural conversation areas while ensuring that confidential communications could not be intercepted by
unauthorized listeners. Messalina's personal contributions to these policy discussions revealed knowledge that impressed even cynical observers who had initially doubted her capabilities. She could analyze the technical specifications of military equipment with precision that amazed veteran commanders. Her understanding of commercial relationships between distant trading partners often exceeded that of merchants who had spent decades developing international business networks. Her grasp of legal principles and administrative procedures demonstrated intellectual capacity that rivaled the most educated senators and government officials. The mid-morning audiences with petitioners had become opportunities to gather intelligence while projecting imperial benevolence to populations throughout the empire. These meetings provided direct access to concerns and challenges affecting different segments of Roman society, while creating networks of obligation that extended her influence far beyond the palace walls. Each encounter was carefully managed to extract maximum information while building personal loyalty among individuals who might prove useful during future political crises. Delegations of provincial officials presented reports that revealed administrative challenges requiring immediate attention. Their accounts of local conditions often contradicted official documents,
providing more accurate assessments of economic situations, military preparedness, and popular sentiment in territories where imperial control remained contested. Messalina's ability to identify inconsistencies and extract truthful information from nervous administrators demonstrated interrogation skills that would have impressed professional intelligence officers. Military veterans seeking assistance presented cases that illuminated conditions in frontier regions where Roman legions faced constant pressure from hostile tribes and ambitious foreign kingdoms. Their stories of service in distant campaigns provided detailed understanding of strategic challenges, while creating personal connections with soldiers whose loyalty could prove essential during political emergencies. The information gathered from these encounters often proved more valuable than formal military reports that might be sanitized to avoid criticism from imperial headquarters. Commercial delegations brought requests that revealed economic trends and trading relationships affecting imperial revenues and strategic resources. Their petitions often contained intelligence about foreign markets, transportation difficulties, and competitive pressures that could influence policy decisions affecting millions of people. Messalina's responses to these requests demonstrated understanding of complex economic relationships that surprised experienced traders who had underestimated her knowledge of commercial matters. The afternoon hours brought social gatherings that served crucial political functions beneath their appearance of feminine leisure and cultural refinement. These meetings took place in reception rooms designed to encourage intimate conversation while maintaining appropriate dignity for high-level political communication. The arrangements created natural opportunities for confidential discussions that could not occur in more formal settings without attracting unwanted attention from potential opponents. The wives and female relatives of prominent officials who attended these gatherings provided access to information that would never appear in official reports or formal communications. Their casual conversations revealed family concerns, personal ambitions, and private assessments of political developments that could influence loyalty during future crises. Messalina's skill in extracting valuable intelligence while maintaining appearances of friendly social interaction demonstrated psychological sophistication that few professional diplomats possessed. The refreshments served during these afternoon receptions were chosen to create specific impressions while accommodating cultural preferences and dietary requirements of diverse guests. Delicacies from throughout the empire demonstrated Roman prosperity, while providing conversation topics that could lead to discussions of provincial conditions and local politics. The quality of entertainment and luxury goods served as subtle reminders of imperial power, while creating atmospheres that encouraged guests to speak more freely than they might in formal governmental settings. Her personal correspondence during the late afternoon hours had expanded to include communications with contacts whose activities extended far beyond official imperial boundaries. These letters appear to discuss routine social matters while actually coordinating intelligence operations that monitored potential threats and opportunities throughout the known world. The encryption systems used for these communications required linguistic skills and cultural knowledge that few people possessed outside of professional diplomatic services. Messages to contacts in Britannia might ostensibly discuss family news while actually providing instructions for monitoring tribal activities that could threaten Roman settlements. Correspondence with associates in eastern territories could appear to focus on trade matters while actually gathering intelligence about Parthian military preparations and diplomatic initiatives. Letters to connections in Africa might appear to address cultural interests while actually coordinating responses to potential rebellions among populations that resented Roman taxation and administrative control. The evening hours brought formal dinners and cultural events that served as forums for the highest levels of imperial politics. These gatherings attracted the most powerful individuals in the empire under circumstances that encouraged informal interaction and confidential communication. The conversations that took place during these events shaped policy decisions and diplomatic relationships that affected the destiny of nations while appearing to focus on entertainment and social refinement. The great halls where these formal events occurred provided settings for political theater that reinforced imperial authority while creating opportunities for subtle coercion and manipulation. Messalina's daring attempts to influence policy decisions during formal dinners were bold and provocative.
She introduced discussions about military strategy during breaks in musical performances, or ate about economic policies while admiring rare artifacts displayed for guests' approval. Maneuvering that determined actual policy outcomes, the physical arrangements reflected careful calculation of status relationships and political alliances. The selection of entertainment conveyed messages about cultural values and imperial priorities that informed observers could interpret to understand current policy directions and future strategic intentions. Messalina's participation in these events served functions that extended far beyond ceremonial representation. Her conversations with individual guests provided opportunities to test policy proposals, gather intelligence about potential opposition, and build personal relationships that could prove crucial during future political challenges. Her ability to move gracefully between different groups while maintaining awareness of multiple conversations simultaneously demonstrated political skills that impressed experienced diplomats and military commanders. The topics discussed during these formal gatherings ranged across every aspect of imperial governance and provided comprehensive understanding of challenges and opportunities throughout the Roman world. Military leaders shared assessments of frontier security while debating strategic alternatives for addressing threats from Germanic confederations, Parthian expansion, and restive populations in recently conquered territories. Provincial administrators discussed infrastructure projects, tax collection difficulties, and local political dynamics that could affect imperial revenues and administrative efficiency. Cultural performances during these events served political functions as well as providing entertainment for distinguished guests. The selection of music, poetry, and dramatic presentations communicated messages about imperial values while demonstrating Rome's capacity to appreciate and incorporate cultural achievements from throughout the civilized world. Greek classical works reminded audiences of intellectual traditions that Rome had inherited and preserved. Historical epics celebrating Roman achievements reinforced pride in imperial accomplishments while suggesting divine favor for continued expansion and conquest. The late evening hours after formal events concluded and most guests departed brought opportunities for private conversations with key individuals whose cooperation was essential for implementing imperial policies. These intimate discussions took place in smaller chambers designed to encourage personal revelation while maintaining appropriate security for sensitive governmental communications. The intelligence gathered during these private meetings often proved more valuable than information obtained through official channels that might be compromised by competing factional interests. The conversations that occurred during these private sessions provided insights into personal motivations and hidden agendas that could not be detected through formal diplomatic procedures. Senior officials might reveal concerns about policy implementations that could affect their regional authority. Military commanders could share confidential assessments of subordinate officers whose reliability might be questionable during crisis situations. Foreign representatives might describe political developments in their territories that required careful imperial response to prevent larger conflicts. Messalina's skill in managing these private discussions reflected understanding that political intelligence was most valuable when it revealed human factors behind official positions and public statements. She learned to recognize indicators of genuine conviction versus tactical maneuvering, to identify individuals whose support could be relied upon during emergencies, and to understand how personal relationships might influence political decisions when traditional loyalties came under pressure from competing interests. The networks of information and alliance that these conversations created extended throughout the empire and provided early warning capabilities that often prevented problems before they required military intervention. Her ability to coordinate responses through informal communications frequently proved more effective than official governmental procedures that moved slowly and attracted attention to sensitive situations that required discreet management. As the palace settled into nighttime quiet, Messalina retreated to private chambers for analytical work that prepared strategies for addressing the following day's challenges. The intelligence gathered during daily activities required systematic evaluation and integration into comprehensive understanding of political trends and strategic developments throughout the empire. This solitary work demanded intellectual capabilities that few people could maintain while managing the social and ceremonial demands of imperial life. Her private study contained reference materials that provided detailed information about every significant political figure, military unit, and economic resource within Roman territory. The walls displayed charts tracking commercial flows, military deployments, and political developments that might affect imperial security or create opportunities for expanding Roman influence. The accumulated data represented years of careful observation and analysis that provided understanding of the empire's condition that perhaps no other individual possessed. The planning process that concluded each day involved reviewing immediate challenges while considering their implications for long-term objectives that might require extended time periods to achieve. Each decision needed to serve multiple purposes while maintaining flexibility to respond to unexpected developments that could emerge without warning from any region of the vast imperial territory. The strategic thinking required for this level of planning exceeded the capabilities of most professional military and diplomatic personnel. Her personal journals, written in codes that only she could decipher, contained assessments of key individuals, analysis of political trends, and strategic plans that extended far into the future. These documents represented accumulated wisdom about the Roman political system that few people of any generation had ever achieved.
The insights recorded in these private notes would prove invaluable as she prepared for challenges that would test the limits of imperial power and personal authority. The late-night hours brought reflection on accomplishments that had exceeded even her most ambitious early expectations. The young woman who had entered imperial politics through strategic marriage had achieved influence that affected daily life for millions of people, while building foundations for even greater authority in years ahead. Her transformation represented one of history's most remarkable examples of individual capability overcoming traditional limitations through systematic preparation and strategic thinking. But even as she reviewed the day's successes, Messalina understood that greater challenges lay ahead. The power she had accumulated carried responsibilities that would require constant vigilance and sophisticated management to maintain. The network she had built needed continuous attention to remain effective. The alliances she had forged required ongoing cultivation to ensure their reliability during future crises that would inevitably test every aspect of her political achievements. The empire itself was changing in ways that created new opportunities while generating fresh threats that had not existed during earlier periods of Roman expansion. The integration of diverse populations under imperial rule created administrative challenges that required innovative solutions. The maintenance of military forces across vast distances strained economic resources and created political tensions between central authority and regional autonomy. The management of relationships with foreign powers demanded diplomatic skills that few Romans possessed, while requiring military preparedness that consumed enormous imperial resources. As sleep finally approached in chambers that had witnessed the planning of policies affecting continents, Messalina could appreciate the magnitude of what she had accomplished, while preparing mentally for challenges that would determine whether her achievements could be sustained and expanded. The teenage concubine who had systematically transformed herself into the most powerful woman in the ancient world had created a foundation for influence that might endure for generations, but only if she could continue to demonstrate the intelligence, determination, and political skill that had enabled her extraordinary rise to unprecedented authority. The morning sun that would soon illuminate the 7 hills of Rome would bring new opportunities to exercise power that no woman in history had previously wielded. The conversations, decisions, and strategic initiatives of each coming day would determine whether her remarkable transformation would establish permanent changes in the nature of imperial governance or represent a unique historical anomaly that would disappear with her personal influence. The answers to these questions would shape not only her individual legacy, but the future development of civilization itself, as it evolved under the guidance of Roman imperial authority that she had learned to influence with unprecedented effectiveness and scope. The morning of March 15th, 48 CE, began with whispers that would echo through history as Messalina prepared for what she believed would be her greatest triumph, but would instead mark the beginning of her spectacular downfall. The servants who moved through her chambers carried with them the nervous energy of those who sensed approaching catastrophe, though none dared speak their fears aloud in the presence of the most powerful woman in Rome. Her daily preparations had become elaborate rituals that reflected the absolute authority she now wielded over an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. The selection of her morning attire required consultation with advisors who understood that every thread, every jewel, every carefully arranged curl communicated messages about imperial policy to audiences throughout the civilized world. She chose garments that spoke of celebration and confidence, unaware that she was dressing for her own political funeral. The intelligence reports that arrived with her breakfast painted a picture of an empire at the height of its power and prosperity. Legions on distant frontiers were securing new territories for Roman civilization. Provincial governors were reporting record tax collections that filled imperial coffers with gold from conquered lands. Trade routes carried exotic goods from India and China to markets in Rome where citizens enjoyed luxuries that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Yet beneath this surface prosperity, currents of resentment and opposition were gathering strength in ways that even her sophisticated intelligence networks had failed to detect. The morning briefings that shaped her understanding of political developments had become exercises in self-deception. As subordinates learned to tell her what she wanted to hear, rather than risk her displeasure with unwelcome truths, her reactions to reports of potential problems had grown increasingly harsh, creating atmospheres of fear that discouraged honest communication about emerging threats to her position. The isolation that accompanied absolute power had begun to cloud her judgment in ways that would prove fatal to her political survival. Her breakfast companions now included individuals whose presence at imperial councils would have been unthinkable during earlier periods of Roman history. Former slaves who had gained her favor through useful services sat beside senators whose ancient lineages trace back to the founding of the Republic. Freedmen whose only qualifications were personal loyalty to Messalina wielded influence over policy decisions that affected entire provinces. This revolutionary mixing of social classes reflected her contempt for traditional Roman hierarchies, while creating resentment among established elites who saw their hereditary privileges being undermined by imperial caprice. The conversations that took place during these morning sessions revealed the extent to which Messalina's perspective on imperial governance had diverged from conventional Roman political wisdom. She spoke casually about appointing her personal favorites to positions of supreme authority, while dismissing concerns about their
qualifications or reliability. Her comments about potential challenges to imperial policy suggested confidence in her ability to overcome any opposition through applications of raw power rather than diplomatic negotiation or political compromise. The petitioners who sought audiences during the mid-morning hours now included individuals whose requests would have been rejected immediately during earlier periods of her influence. Actors and entertainers sought government positions typically reserved for experienced administrators. Merchants with no understanding of military affairs requested appointments as provincial commanders. Foreign adventurers with dubious credentials petitioned for Roman citizenship and senatorial rank. Messalina's willingness to consider these outrageous requests reflected her growing disconnection from the practical requirements of effective governance. Her responses to legitimate petitions revealed judgment that had become increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Reasonable requests from qualified candidates were rejected for trivial reasons, while obviously inappropriate proposals received enthusiastic endorsement. Provincial governors who had served with distinction for years found themselves replaced by inexperienced favorites whose primary qualifications were personal relationships with the empress. Military commanders who had achieved victory in difficult campaigns were transferred to insignificant positions while their commands were given to individuals with no battlefield experience. The afternoon receptions that had once served as sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations had devolved into social gatherings where flattery and gossip replaced serious political discussion. The wives of prominent officials who attended these meetings learned to avoid honest conversation about imperial policies, while focusing on trivial topics that would not trigger unpredictable emotional reactions. The atmosphere of fear that now characterized these supposedly social occasions reflected the transformation of Messalina's court from a center of political sophistication into a dangerous environment where any comment might be interpreted as criticism or disloyalty. The refreshments served during these afternoon gatherings had become displays of extravagance that shocked even Romans accustomed to imperial luxury. Delicacies imported at enormous expense from distant corners of the empire were consumed casually while discussions focused on increasingly frivolous topics. The entertainment provided during these events emphasized spectacle over substance, with performances chosen for their shock value rather than their artistic merit or cultural significance. The overall effect was to create impressions of imperial decadence that undermined respect for Roman authority among both domestic and foreign observers. Her correspondence during the late afternoon hours had expanded to include communications with individuals whose activities threatened the stability of imperial governance. Messages to provincial officials contained instructions that contradicted established policies, while demanding immediate implementation regardless of practical consequences. Letters to military commanders included orders that revealed fundamental misunderstanding of strategic realities and tactical requirements. Communications with foreign representatives suggested diplomatic initiatives that could provoke unnecessary conflicts while providing no corresponding benefits to Roman interests. The encoding systems used for these messages had become increasingly complex as Messalina's paranoia about potential opposition led her to suspect disloyalty among even her most trusted associates. The secretaries responsible for managing her correspondence worked under constant supervision, while being required to sign oaths of absolute secrecy about the content of imperial communications. The atmosphere of suspicion that surrounded these activities reflected growing awareness that many of her instructions were inappropriate or potentially dangerous to imperial security. The evening hours brought formal dinners that had transformed from sophisticated political gatherings into theatrical performances designed to reinforce Messalina's personal authority rather than advance imperial interests. The guest list for these events now included individuals whose presence in imperial functions scandalized traditional Roman society while providing no corresponding political benefits. Former slaves sat in positions of honor, while distinguished senators were relegated to inferior places that reflected their diminished influence within the imperial court. The conversations that took place during these formal gatherings revealed the extent to which serious political discussion had been replaced by entertainment and spectacle. Military strategy was debated by individuals with no battlefield experience, while economic policies were analyzed by people whose understanding of commerce was limited to personal luxury purchases. Foreign relations were discussed by advisors whose knowledge of international affairs was derived entirely from gossip and speculation, rather than diplomatic experience or scholarly study. The entertainment provided during these evening events had become increasingly elaborate and expensive while contributing nothing to the serious business of imperial governance. Performances by exotic dancers and musicians from distant provinces were intended to impress foreign guests with Roman wealth and sophistication, but actually created impressions of imperial frivolity and misplaced priorities. The overall effect was to undermine respect for Roman authority while wasting resources that could have been used for legitimate governmental purposes.
The late evening hours after formal events concluded and guests departed brought private conversations that revealed Messalina's growing isolation from the political realities that would ultimately determine her fate. Her closest advisors had learned to avoid honest discussion of potential problems while focusing on topics that flattered her ego and reinforced her broken sense of reality.
Would reinforce her confidence in her own invulnerability. The feedback mechanisms that had once provided accurate information about political developments had been systematically dismantled through her reactions to unwelcome news. The intelligence networks that had once provided comprehensive understanding of threats and opportunities throughout the empire had deteriorated as sources learned to avoid reporting information that might trigger imperial displeasure. Provincial administrators stopped sending accurate assessments of local conditions, while military commanders began sanitizing their reports to avoid criticism of policies they privately considered disastrous. The result was an information environment that reinforced Messalina's misconceptions while preventing her from recognizing the growing opposition to her authority. Her private planning sessions during the midnight hours had become exercises in fantasy rather than realistic strategic thinking. The maps and charts that covered the walls of her study now displayed imaginary conquests and impossible administrative arrangements that reflected her disconnection from practical constraints on imperial power. Her personal journals recorded assessments of political situations that bore little resemblance to actual conditions, while documenting strategic plans that could never be implemented successfully. The daily routines that had once demonstrated sophisticated understanding of imperial governance had become ritualistic performances that served no practical purpose while consuming enormous amounts of time and resources. The morning briefings provided false reassurance rather than useful intelligence. The afternoon receptions created atmospheres of fear rather than productive political communication. The evening gatherings reinforced isolation rather than building effective alliances. Yet even as these patterns of dysfunction became increasingly obvious to outside observers, Messalina remained confident in her ability to maintain absolute control over imperial policy and personnel decisions. Her morning preparations continued to reflect expectations of continued authority, while her daily activities proceeded according to schedules that assumed permanent dominance over Roman political life. The disconnect between her perceptions and political reality had become so complete that she could no longer recognize the signs of approaching catastrophe. The palace servants who attended her daily needs had begun to whisper among themselves about the empress, whose behavior had become increasingly erratic and whose demands had grown more unreasonable with each passing week. The slaves who prepared her chambers each morning worked in fearful silence, while wondering how long their mistress could maintain her position before the forces gathering against her finally achieved sufficient strength to challenge her authority directly. The morning of March 15th represented the culmination of patterns that had been developing for months, as Messalina's absolute power corrupted her judgment, while isolating her from the political intelligence that had once enabled her remarkable success. The teenage concubine, who had systematically transformed herself into the most powerful woman in the ancient world, was about to discover that even the most sophisticated political skills could not protect someone who had lost touch with the realities that ultimately determined the distribution of power within the Roman Empire. The sun that rose over the 7 hills on that fateful morning illuminated an empire where the woman who had once wielded unprecedented influence was preparing for activities that would trigger the final crisis of her extraordinary career. The intelligence, determination, and strategic vision that had enabled her rise to supreme authority would prove insufficient to prevent the spectacular collapse that was already beginning as forces beyond her control moved to restore traditional patterns of imperial governance. The daily rituals that began before dawn would continue according to familiar patterns, while the political foundations of her authority crumbled beneath the weight of her own mistakes and the resentment of enemies she had created through years of increasingly arbitrary and destructive decision-making. The transformation from strategic genius to isolated autocrat was nearly complete, and the consequences would reshape the Roman world in ways that neither she nor her opponents could fully anticipate. The morning preparations that had once symbolized methodical accumulation of unprecedented female power now represented the final hours of an experiment in government that had challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority in the ancient world. Whether her legacy would inspire future generations of women to seek similar authority or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited power would depend on how history remembered the remarkable rise and spectacular fall of the most influential women in Roman civilization. As the servants completed their familiar tasks and the first visitors prepared to seek audiences with the empress, the stage was set for events that would determine not only Messalina's personal fate, but the future development of imperial institutions that governed the civilized world. The woman who had achieved the impossible was about to learn that maintaining revolutionary change required different skills than creating it, and that even the most sophisticated political minds could be destroyed by the very power they had worked so hard to acquire and exercise. The familiar sounds of Rome awakening to another day provided a soundtrack for activities that would soon be remembered as the final performance of one of history's most extraordinary political careers. Everything she had built through intelligence, ambition, and strategic vision was about to be tested in ways that would reveal both the remarkable achievements and the ultimate limitations of individual power within systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of authority she had managed to accumulate through decades of careful planning and flawless execution. The afternoon hours of that March day brought ceremonies that would seal Messalina's fate, though she remained blissfully unaware as she prepared for what she believed would be her ultimate triumph over the traditional constraints of Roman society. The marble corridors of the palace echoed with the footsteps of conspirators disguised as loyal servants, while the empress herself moved through her daily routine with the confidence of someone who believed she had finally overcome the obstacles to immortality, who had forgotten that power without wisdom inevitably leads to destruction. Her personal chambers had been transformed into a staging area for the most audacious political maneuver in Roman history. As Messalina prepared to formalize a relationship that would shatter every convention governing imperial marriage and succession, the silk curtains that provided privacy for her preparations concealed activities that would have shocked even the most cynical observers of Roman politics, while the incense burning in golden braziers masked the scent of fear that permeated the atmosphere despite her outward confidence. The selection of her ceremonial attire for the afternoon's events required consultation with advisors who understood the symbolic significance of every detail, while remaining carefully silent about the political consequences of what she was planning to undertake. The garments chosen for this unprecedented occasion were designed to project authority and legitimacy, while subtly challenging traditional Roman values about female behavior and imperial dignity. Her jewelry included pieces that had belonged to previous empresses, appropriated without permission to reinforce her claims to supreme authority within the imperial household. The preparation rituals that had once demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political symbolism had become exercises in revolutionary theater that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying her desire to demolish established social hierarchies. Her personal slaves, many of whom had been elevated to positions of inappropriate responsibility, assisted with arrangements that reflected her complete disconnection from the political realities that would determine the success or failure of her unprecedented initiative. The morning briefings that should have warned her about growing opposition to her authority had instead reinforced her confidence in her ability to overcome any resistance through applications of raw power and personal charisma. The intelligence reports she received painted reassuring pictures of imperial stability while carefully omitting information about the secret meetings and private communications that were coordinating responses to her increasingly erratic behavior. Her advisors had learned to filter unwelcome news while emphasizing developments that supported her unrealistic assessments of her own invulnerability. The correspondence that arrived with her breakfast included messages from supporters who encouraged her most dangerous impulses while failing to provide honest assessments of the political risks associated with her planned actions. Letters from provincial officials contained flattering reassurances about popular support that bore no relationship to actual public opinion in territories where her policies had created widespread resentment. Communications from military commanders offered pledges of loyalty that were either insincere or based on incomplete understanding of what she was actually planning to accomplish. The mid-morning audiences with petitioners had been carefully orchestrated to include only individuals whose presence would reinforce her confidence, while excluding anyone who might raise uncomfortable questions about the wisdom of her intended course of action. The visitors who gained access to her reception chambers were selected for their willingness to provide enthusiastic support, rather than their ability to offer realistic assessments of political feasibility or potential consequences. The conversations that took place during these meetings focused on implementation details, rather than fundamental questions about whether her plans could possibly succeed. Her personal secretary, a freed woman whose elevation to a position of significant responsibility exemplified the social revolution that Messalina was attempting to institutionalize, managed communications with individuals whose cooperation would be essential for the afternoon ceremonies. These messages were crafted to emphasize the historical significance of what was being undertaken while minimizing discussion of the legal and political obstacles that made success highly unlikely. The recipients of these communications were encouraged to focus on their personal benefits from participating rather than considering the broader implications for imperial stability. The physical preparations for the afternoon's events required coordination between multiple groups of conspirators who had been recruited through promises of advancement that could only be fulfilled if traditional Roman political institutions were completely restructured. The logistics alone involved dozens of people whose discretion could not be guaranteed and whose motivations ranged from genuine loyalty to Messalina to purely mercenary calculations about personal advantage. The complexity of these arrangements created numerous opportunities for information leaks that could expose the entire enterprise to hostile intervention. The location chosen for the ceremonies reflected Messalina's determination to challenge conventional restrictions on imperial behavior while demonstrating her contempt for traditional protocols governing marriage within the royal family. The site was selected for its symbolic significance rather than its security characteristics, creating vulnerabilities that more experienced conspirators would have recognized as potentially fatal to the success of their enterprise. The decorations and arrangements emphasized spectacle over prudence, while attracting exactly the kind of attention that successful political conspiracies typically sought to avoid. The guest list for these unprecedented ceremonies included individuals whose presence would scandalize traditional Roman society while providing no corresponding political benefits to justify the risks being undertaken. Former slaves were invited to witness events that challenged fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and imperial dignity. Foreign adventurers whose loyalty was questionable were included in activities that required absolute discretion and unwavering commitment. The overall composition of the gathering reflected Messalina's priorities while ignoring basic security considerations that should have governed such a sensitive undertaking. The entertainment planned for the afternoon's festivities was designed to reinforce the revolutionary character of what was being accomplished while demonstrating complete disregard for conventional Roman values about appropriate behavior at formal gatherings.
Ceremonies. Musicians and performers were selected for their ability to create atmospheres of celebration, rather than their understanding of the political sensitivities involved in challenging established imperial institutions. The overall program emphasized spectacle and emotional impact while ignoring the diplomatic requirements that govern successful political transitions. The refreshments prepared for the gathering included delicacies that demonstrated imperial wealth and sophistication, while serving no practical purpose in building the political coalitions that would be necessary to sustain whatever changes were being implemented. The wines selected for the occasion were chosen for their rarity and expense, rather than their capacity to facilitate the serious political discussions that should have accompanied such a momentous occasion. The entire approach to hospitality reflected priorities that emphasized personal pleasure over strategic necessity. The security arrangements for the afternoon's events revealed the extent to which Messalina's judgment had been compromised by years of unchallenged authority and systematic isolation from honest political advice. The guards assigned to protect the ceremonies were selected for their personal loyalty, rather than their professional competence or understanding of the broader political context that made their responsibilities particularly challenging. The overall security posture reflected confidence in popular support that bore no relationship to actual public opinion about the Empress and her policies. The timing chosen for these unprecedented activities demonstrated complete disregard for the political calendar and strategic considerations that should have influenced such important decisions. The afternoon hours selected for the ceremonies conflicted with other imperial activities that required Claudius's attention, while creating opportunities for opponents to organize responses without interference. The overall schedule reflected personal convenience rather than strategic thinking about how to maximize chances of success while minimizing opportunities for hostile intervention. The legal preparations that should have provided foundation for the changes being implemented were either inadequate or completely absent, reflecting Messalina's assumption that personal authority could substitute for institutional legitimacy. The documents that were supposed to formalize the new arrangements contained language that challenged fundamental principles of Roman law, while failing to address obvious questions about succession and governmental continuity. The entire legal framework reflected amateur understanding of constitutional requirements while ignoring precedents that had governed imperial transitions for generations. The communication strategy designed to manage public reaction to the afternoon's events was based on unrealistic assumptions about popular attitudes toward imperial authority and social change. The messages prepared for distribution throughout the city emphasized personal benefits that most citizens would never receive, while ignoring concerns about stability and tradition that actually motivated public opinion. The overall approach reflected disconnection from popular sentiment, while demonstrating naive confidence in the power of imperial propaganda to shape political reality. The contingency planning that should have addressed potential opposition or unexpected complications were either superficial or completely absent, reflecting Messalina's belief that her personal authority could overcome any resistance through force or persuasion. The preparations for dealing with hostile reactions focused on suppressing opposition rather than building coalitions that could sustain political change over extended periods. The entire approach demonstrated tactical thinking, while ignoring strategic requirements for successful political transformation. As the afternoon approached and final preparations were completed, Messalina remained confident that her intelligence, determination, and political skills would enable her to achieve what no Roman woman had ever attempted, while overcoming obstacles that had defeated previous challenges to imperial authority. Her morning routines continued according to familiar patterns.
while the political foundations of her power were already crumbling beneath the weight of forces that she had underestimated and opponents whose capabilities she had dismissed. The servants who attended her final preparations moved with the nervous energy of people who sensed approaching catastrophe, while lacking the authority or courage to warn their mistress about the dangers she was creating through her own actions. The chambers that had once symbolized unprecedented female authority were becoming stages for the final performance of a political career that had challenged fundamental assumptions about power and gender in the ancient world. The afternoon sun that illuminated the 7 hills of Rome would soon witness events that would determine whether Messalina's remarkable achievements could be sustained through the crisis she was creating, or whether her extraordinary influence would be remembered only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited ambition unchecked by political wisdom. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to supreme authority was about to discover that maintaining revolutionary change required different skills than creating it, and that even the most brilliant political minds could be destroyed by the very power they had worked so hard to acquire. The familiar sounds of imperial life continued around her as she prepared for ceremonies that would either establish permanent changes in Roman political institutions or mark the spectacular end of one of history's most integral,
remarkable experiments in female authority. Everything she had built through decades of careful planning and strategic thinking was about to be tested in ways that would reveal both the extraordinary nature of her achievements and the ultimate limitations of individual power within systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of transformation she had managed to accomplish through intelligence, ambition, and flawless political execution. The stage was set for events that would determine not only her personal fate, but the future development of imperial governance and social relationships throughout the civilized world. The teenager who had entered the imperial court with nothing but determination and strategic vision had created possibilities that would influence political development for generations. But whether those possibilities would survive the crisis she was creating would depend on forces beyond her control and opponents whose capabilities she had consistently underestimated throughout her extraordinary career. As the afternoon ceremonies began and the most powerful woman in the ancient world prepared to challenge the final constraints on her authority, the Roman Empire itself held its breath while awaiting the outcome of a confrontation that would reshape the ancient world in ways that neither she nor her enemies could fully anticipate or control. And so our journey through the marble corridors of imperial Rome draws to a close as the afternoon shadows lengthen across the 7 hills and the echoes of Messalina's footsteps fade into history. What began as the calculated ascent of a 16-year-old girl with nothing but intelligence and ambition became a cautionary tale that would resonate through the ages, reminding us that even the most brilliant minds can be undone by the very power they seek to master. From her morning preparations in the family villa to her final moments as empress, we've witnessed how methodical planning and strategic thinking could transform a powerless concubine into the most influential woman of the ancient world. Yet we've also seen how absolute authority, unchecked by wisdom and disconnected from reality, inevitably leads to spectacular downfall. The daily rituals that once demonstrated sophisticated political understanding became hollow performances that served no purpose beyond feeding an ego that had grown too large for even an empire to contain. Messalina's story teaches us that true power lies not in commanding others, but in understanding oneself.
The teenager who had once read every gesture and calculated every conversation with mathematical precision became a woman who could no longer see the forces gathering against her. The intelligence networks that had once provided her with unprecedented insight into the Roman world became echo chambers that reflected only what she wanted to hear. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that history's greatest figures often rose highest just before their most dramatic falls. In the quiet darkness, perhaps you can still hear the whisper of silk against marble, the scratch of stylus on wax, and the soft conversations that once shaped the destiny of nations. Sweet dreams, friend, and may your own ambitions be tempered by the wisdom that Messalina, for all her brilliance, ultimately failed to find.